When one thinks of the Mandalorians, it's almost impossible not to also think about their armor, as it has grown to become synonymous with the warriors who would emerge upon the Outer Rim planet of Mandalore. The history of the Mandalorians is intertwined with the development of the practice of wearing armor, which became a central tenet of the Mandalorian way of life, codified within the 6 actions that guided them. In this video expose, we'll look at how the first Mandalorians originally came to adopt the practice of wearing armor, and explain how this practice would evolve throughout the millennia, where although it remained a defining feature of Mandalorian culture, it took on a new meaning that was extremely distinct from the original Mandalorian practice. The Mandalorian practice of wearing armor extends back to the Tong species that would eventually rise to establish Mandalorian society. After the Tong were forced from Coruscant after generations of warfare against Coruscant's humans who formed the Battalions of Zell, the Tong sought refuge where they could find it, traveling from planet to planet on the orders of their war chief, leading them to planets like Rune in the Outer Rim. During this time, still millennia before the Clone War, armor was worn by the Tong in warfare, but it was far different than that which would be worn by the Mandalorians thousands of years later. It was far more organic, which could be seen in the armor depicted through their destroyer god Cad Harangir, with a focus on protection during melee combat. But to know why the Mandalorians wore armor, and why this was such an important pillar in Mandalorian society, it's necessary to look at the Tong conquest of the planet Mandalore, which occurred roughly 7,000 years before the Clone War. Led by the warlord and leader of the Tong, known as Mandalore I, the Tong would conquer Mandalore. The planet and the entire Mandalore system was rich in a resource known as Beskar, or Mandalorian iron. It's believed by some within galactic history that it was Mandalorian iron that drew the Tong to the planet in the first place. The discovery of Mandalorian iron would have profound effects on the Tong practice of wearing armor. It was extremely strong, capable of deflecting blaster bolts and the lightsaber blades of the Jedi. And yet, it was also extremely light and flexible, allowing it to be manipulated into practically any form desired. Therefore, after years of experimentation, the Tong who conquered Mandalore would learn to forge the planet's Mandalorian iron into armor, which would come to define them, with those adopting it coming to be known as Mandalorian Crusaders. This discovery was perfect for the Tong at the time, for after thousands of years of warfare defining their culture and society, establishing a central warrior's code, the Shadow Warriors as they would come to be known, saw hand-to-hand combat as a warrior's highest calling. On this basis, the use of armor facilitated the beliefs that were already established by these early Mandalorians that lived 7,000 years before the Clone War. Over the next 3,000 years, the Mandalorians would craft armor that was defined by individualism and clan tradition, meaning that there was a tremendous variety in the look of the armor worn by these Mandalorians. This individualism was a point of pride, as the armor of one's ancestors was traditionally melted down and reforged to continue to share in the tradition, but also resulted in a new custom-made suit. The result of this was armor that differed greatly from clan to clan, and even Mandalorian to Mandalorian within the clan, with helmets more often than not resembling the face of its wearer. But again, in this early era of Mandalorians, from about 7,000 to 4,000 years before the Clone War, uniformity was not the end goal. The Mandalorians of this era benefited from the discovery of Mandalorian iron, which resulted in a practice where armor was to be worn as part of the teachings known as the Rvmuller, or 6 actions, practices that made Mandalorians Mandalorians. So important was the practice of wearing armor, it was itself one of the 6 actions. Therefore, the original practice of the Tong species in wearing armor went back millennia, but once they conquered Mandalore, the custom took on a new significance, becoming a defining feature within Mandalorian society, speaking to their warrior code that saw hand-to-hand combat as a warrior's highest calling, and something that separated Mandalorians from all others. However, the practice of wearing armor would evolve in a significant way for the Mandalorians following the Great Sith War, which erupted roughly 4,000 years before the Clone War. As we mentioned previously, the armor of the Mandalorian Crusaders that emerged after the conquest of the planet Mandalore was defined by individualism, where custom-made armor differed from clan to clan, and even for each Mandalorian comprising a clan. But after the Great Sith War, upon the emergence of Mandalore the Ultimate as the new leader of the Mandalorians, both the armor of the Mandalorians and the reason for its adoption changed significantly. The new armor of this era would take on the name of Neo-Crusader, the next step in the evolution of Mandalorian armor from the Crusaders that came before them. Following the Great Sith War, the ranks of the Mandalorians had been decimated. But perhaps even worse, the Tong had descended into an extremely factious society, with little unity among the clans as had been the case in the era before the war. Bolstered by a grand vision he received, Mandalore the Ultimate was determined to restore Mandalorian society to greatness, seeing a better way ahead and expanding their meager holdings within the Outer Rim. For the first time in its history, to create a military force capable of greatness on a galactic level, Mandalore the Ultimate allowed non-Tongs to join Mandalorian clans, so long as they proved themselves in battle and upheld the warrior code that had been established over the previous millennia. This decision succeeded as the Mandalorian ranks increased greatly, bolstered by humans and other species who desired to carry on the Mandalorian tradition. And yet, this decision also brought its own problems. Unlike the Mandalorians of the previous era, there was no shared history among their ranks to create natural bonds in combat. Seeing themselves as Mandalorians, they carried on the traditions before them. They were simply united through their warrior code. Mandalore the Ultimate recognized he needed more than this if he was going to establish a military force capable of taking on the Republic. Fortunately, an ingenious idea from Mandalore the Ultimate's chief strategist Cassus Fett turned to the traditions established through the Mandalorian practice and teachings of wearing armor. To further foster unity among the new Mandalorians and the Tong, Fett and Mandalore the Ultimate designed and crafted the Neo-Crusader armor that would define their Neo-Crusader movement. Because of this, it was now the armor itself that defined one as Mandalorian. The Neo-Crusader armor, outside of the different colors that signified rank and a few other minor differences for different units such as shock troopers, was now completely unified, eliminating the individualism within the armor that had been so important to the earlier Crusaders. Therefore, the reason why the Mandalorians of this era, the era of Mandalore the Ultimate and the Mandalorian Wars, wore armor had completely changed. Outside of its obvious military benefits, the Mandalorians wore armor as a way in which to foster unity among those that now comprised the Mandalorian ranks, which itself was a significant change from the previous era. This decision further increased the importance of wearing armor. We'll end our video by noting here that after the fall of Mandalore the Ultimate and the Mandalorian Wars, roughly 3,000 years later, a new leader of the Mandalorians, named Mandalore the Uniter, attempted to restore and rebuild Mandalore and its culture, turning to the armor and the practices established through wearing it to help his efforts. Speaking to his name as the Uniter, this Mandalore, who reigned during the New Sith Wars, roughly 1,000 years before the Clone War, would attempt to amalgamate the best qualities of the Crusader and Neo-Crusader armors. Like Cassus Fett and Mandalore the Ultimate, Mandalore the Uniter would mass-produce a new configuration of armor that was to be adopted by the Mandalorians of this era. However, like the Crusader armor, he allowed for individualization and personal choice in the armor's weaponry and colors. It was this version of Mandalorian armor that would go on to be worn by the Mandalorians for the next 1,000 years, extending into the era of the Star Wars films, with the Death Watch, New Mandalorians, and Mandalorian Super Commandos all carrying on the traditions that began with the Mandalorian Crusaders and Neo-Crusaders. So there we have it, why Mandalorians wore armor and the transformation in the meaning behind its adoption. Thank you very much to all of the Patreon members of Star Wars Reading Club, as your support is so greatly appreciated. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can find a link to it in the description below, along with all of our social media links and a link to our Star Wars gaming channel. We love making these videos, so why not subscribe for more fun Star Wars theories and discussions. Also, if you enjoyed the video, think about giving a like or leaving a comment. If not for me... For the Neo-Crusaders.